Mollie Claypool is an architecture theorist and educator focused on issues of social justice, highlighted by increasing automation in architecture and design production, and the potential of automation in architecture and the built environment to provide more socially engaged and environmentally sustainable ways of designing and building. Very connected to also the topics of non-extractive architecture. So we're really excited to have Mollie here. Mollie is also a co-author of the book Robotic Building, Architecture in the Age of Automation, and the author of the Space 10 report, The Digital in Architecture, Then, Now, and the Future. She is associate professor in architecture at the Bartlett School of Architecture, UCL, where she is co-director of automated architecture, AUAR Labs, and history theory coordinator in the MArch architectural design. Mollie is co-founder and CEO of the AUAR Labs, spinout AUAR Ltd, a design and technology company. Mollie is also the managing editor of Perspectives, an open access peer-reviewed journal supported by the Bartlett. She studied at Pratt Institute, AA School of Architecture, and the Bartlett. Wow, thank you so much, Mollie. We're so happy to have you with us, and I'll hand it over to you.
Thanks so much for having me. It's a delight to be able to make this happen after trying to figure out how it could. So thanks so much for having me today. I'm gonna blow really quickly through our work, and I'm always going to be. It's really important, I think, in the work that it's not my work; it's our work. It's the work of AUAR, which is AUAR or AUAR, and it's the company, the spinout of the work I'm going to show is both the research lab, which is based at the Bartlett, but also the spinout company. So I might be talking about either one at any one time. And I'm also talking about AUAR as a collective decision-making group. And the projects that I'm showing are not really like large projects, both in terms of scale or budget, but they often have had really large teams embedded in the processes of decision-making. So on the 4 projects, I'm actually going to show 4 projects I'm going to show. From the last 2 years of work, there's really a few hundred people working together. And it's important to note that these people are primarily not people with built environment expertise. They're not architects, they're not engineers, they're not technologists, they're not academics. They're the people who live and work in the communities that our work is taking place in. And this is really a key part of the strategy for how we think about automation around these collective decision-making structures. So we're really interested in understanding how automation can provide a better opportunity for designing better production practices for architecture that can be more accountable and more aligned to the community's value systems of the communities that we're working in. So in our work, we like to think about the ways that we can dismantle power structures that have contributed to the status quo. We have existing methods of production that are really not geared to addressing major global issues, and this is very familiar territory for architects. But we have to address these issues. So for example, we need 2 billion new homes over the next 80 years. And in the UK, where I'm based, we have a huge scarcity, not just of the companies that are able to deliver on these kinds of housing, but a scarcity of land due to the huge amounts of financialization. Over 50% of England is owned by less than 1% of the population, and we only have 10 major house builders in the UK. And this has really created a scenario where in the UK alone, 1 in 7 people are affected by the housing crisis. These are numbers that represent different kinds of housing precarity, homelessness, overcrowding, rent arrears. 1 in 7 is a significant number. And we also have existing methods of production that are really not geared towards the climate emergency. So, one of my favorite statistics is if the cement industry were a country, it would be the 3rd largest emitter in the world. And we really need to think carefully about how these issues are wrapped up together. And also if we look, we're looking here at construction, but we're also looking at policy making. And planning is also not really well suited to deliver on these needs. So we see oftentimes in the UK really top-down consultation practice, and this treats communities really as though they're afterthoughts, and has produced a really huge lack of trust in planning processes and a culture of NIMBYism. And this really widens the divide between those house builders, those policymakers, and those communities that desperately need homes. And then if we look more closely at the discipline, we can see the architecture as a profession has really become much more fragile. There's very insufficient disciplinary practices that are based on competition, that are based on undervaluing, on bidding culture. And a great example of this is this competition, very famous. Well, we all probably know it. Maybe you submitted to it. It created over $6.8 million in free labor. And this is a disciplinary practice. This is the epitome of this, of the inefficiency of this disciplinary practice. And then if we switch and look at technology, I'm really interested in automation. We're looking at dominant narratives around automation. So the dominant narrative in automation and construction has really been around the loss of jobs that use manual labor, and the digital fabrication technologies that are being developed to replace these jobs tend to focus purely on the productivity gained by implementing these kinds of technologies. For example, here, a bricklaying robot, but we also have tile laying robots, et cetera. And other benefits kind of become peripheral to issues of productivity and efficiencies. And when we look at them more closely, we see that these kinds of technologies are products that are really only available for those with extreme wealth. This one in particular, Sam, the bricklaying robot, it's also called Hadrian in the UK, cost $500,000 when it was first launched 6 years ago. And right now it costs £16,000 a month to rent in the UK. So while these robots are extremely limited, the robots are extremely limited, and there might be innovations in terms of how we think about what a job might be in construction. They're also very much solving only narrow, localized issues, and they're really inaccessible. Generally speaking, they're actually now on black markets and like eBay as well, which is kind of amusing. And then if we scale out, so we scale away from the scale of the technology, and we think about the scale of production or production frameworks, we're also looking at automation at the scale of the factory. And what we've seen is that the scale of automation in terms of housing at the scale of the factory has really looked at automobile manufacturing as an example. And modular housing factories are really taking these massive factories and putting housing production into a centralized system. We have the centralization of housing production to offsite factories that are disconnected to the context in which they're deployed. And therefore, what that results in is that factory-made housing is seen as displacing local jobs. And this creates resistance and skepticism among local communities, and also creates very limited localized capacity for housing using automation, because you have this lack of trust and skepticism that is built into this kind of centralized framework. And the failure of this model is really currently very acute. This is a very big story earlier this year where the construction unicorn Katerra collapsed and filed for bankruptcy. And Katerra is a really great example of how that automation gap in construction, where construction is one of the least automated industries in the world, is really not just a problem that can be solved by a single technology or a vertically integrated production chain. It's not just a problem of efficiency. It's not just a problem of productivity. It's a problem of design. And design touches on, for example, frameworks for labor, the interdependence of things, the resilience of systems, policymaking, decision-making, but also care. And this is where we're sort of landing with our work. And what we see is that all of those practices are historically constructed. And as much as they can be constructed, they are therefore designed. And as much as they are designed and constructed, they can be redesigned and reconstructed. So automation for us gives us an opportunity to not really play innocent anymore. Automation isn't an innocent thing. It immediately begins to force positions, immediately begins to ask questions about what a fully automated society might mean. It asks questions like, who owns the robots? What kind of ownership models are in place? Which jobs kind of remain? What kind of housing do we want to live in? How do we produce that? And there are really deep cultural issues within building production that highlight the current practices that we have already that can adapt to automation. And when we use the term automation, what we think is that architects are suddenly forced to really think about those big questions: labor, platforms, jobs, control, ownership. And therefore, automation is really a design project. So what then is architecture designed for automation, or what is an architectural framework for production designed for automation. In our work, what we've proposed is that we have to radically redesign how architectural parts are designed in relationship to automation, both as a process in terms of the technologies we use, but also as a framework in terms of the context in which we're working. And so, for example, how accessible is automation for the people we work with and serve? And what this resulted in is a proposition that significant reduction of architectural parts is possible. And this enables a rethink around the dichotomy that exists between design, automation, and building cultures. Now, this is known as the discrete, where architectural parts are not constrained to types like columns or floor slabs or beams or staircases. And instead, we think of architectural parts as similar to zeros and ones in code. And the same building part can then be used to construct every part of a building's core structure. Now, part of the discrete approach in our work is also embedding enough intelligence and simplicity into architectural parts to enable people to engage with and interact with them in very intuitive ways. So part of that design of the discrete block itself is to design ways of working with that can empower communities to participate in designing and making. And this subsequently allows and enables them to take back that power around what is in their built environment and kind of create the homes and spaces that they need. So we also have values in the intersection in the block in terms of the intersection between automation and waste optimization. This sits in contrast to the kind of mass customization strategy using other forms of automation. Block type A, which was the first version of our building block in our housing system, one sheet of timber equaled one building block that's repeatedly cut and can be manufactured almost anywhere. Block type A is a prefabricated tension system, or post-tension system, and it allows and incorporates reversible connections so we can reconfigure and adapt the system or assembly over time. Now, this is based on principles from mechanical engineering called digital materials that behind it has principles of part variation and part reversibility. Now, these versions of the blocks also use very simple tools, off-the-shelf tools. It requires very little expertise and training to both prefab the tools and to assemble the tools. The spinout, we're currently working on fully automating a new version of the block for both prefabrication and building assembly that also decreases the manual prefab time, making it super optimized for people to work with it with their hands still. Now, if we move away a little bit from the part, because I'm going to show you some work in a second, and we think about the framework for production, we generally have seen automation for what it is, as you can see in the Terra framework, largely centralized and highly extractive. And we're very much interested in notions of collectivity, where workers have ownership over both the methods and modes of production, as well as the things that they produce. And a key part of this for us is trying to design frameworks for automation that distributes expertise and keeps the value that's co-created by the communities that create within those communities that are producing. And in our case, this is prototypes for production as well as prototypes for homes, or now we're heading into producing homes themselves. So one of the ways that we've done this in the lab is by working across the country to develop partnerships and projects with organizations that are actively working at the local or community scale. And our collaborations build networks across the UK, currently along the Southwest Corridor and the Midlands. And the organizations that we're working with are primarily citizen-led or community-led or arts-led organizations that put at the core of the work an ethics of care around how we do the work, which allows us to begin to recognize that both enabling participation and participating in built environment production is extremely difficult, so that we really must embed principles of care and support at the very core of the projects that we do with the communities we're working with. So one of the ways that we're thinking about this is working towards a cooperative model where the communities that we work with also become stakeholders in the platform that's created it themselves. So in the lab and in the spin out, we've designed a mission lock, or a set of principles that guides our future plans. And it begins to really allow us to protect that social purpose as we scale the work, not just in terms of strategic partnerships, but also within those communities or in conversations around any investment that we might take on board in the company in particular. So this is the opening line to the mission lock. We design horizontal, participatory, and equal social practices in architecture and technology, where individual autonomy and freedom, supported in a structure of care, leads to more creative, inspired, and empowered people and more just built environments. Now, what we have found is that this makes the process of design production much more accessible for people typically othered by professional practice. And this really allows us to widen the boundaries of who can participate in the work. And a really core question that we ask ourselves is, what is the capacity of engaged scholarship, or what's called a values-centered approach, to enhancing citizen-led design using automation and new housing and construction systems? And engaged scholarship is an interesting thing for us because we're academics. They're now in developing a new kind of practice. And engaged scholarship is typically about how you take that practice from outside of the university setting. So engaged scholarship technically is equalizing how you equalize power relations, democratic practices, situation-based action, mutual learning, tools and techniques, and alternative visions about technology. So we have 4 principles that we use primarily, and I'll go through those very quickly. So first is an ethics of, and they're all embedded in an ethics of care. The first one is how we use organizational ethnographic research. This is a mode of inquiry which focuses not just on really established and formalized cultures, but also on informal subcultures. And these act as the kind of settings within which social relations take place between actors moving towards a particular goal. So we're very much interested in how we capture that. A second principle is that we propose embedding work on automation and architecture within the history of participatory design in architecture. This is an example of Walter Segal, for example. And then the third is that we devise approaches and methodologies that take an asset-based approach. So the core of an asset-based approach is not asking the question when you come into a new community, what needs to be fixed? Instead, it asks what's already here, what's missing, what needs to be brought to the surface. So we're not trying to come in to be solution making, we're here to ask questions and have that become emergent. So that helps us begin to think about what is our ethics of care. So one of the core things here is that we need to build trust in a system that has generally broken down. So at the very core, we need to begin to think about how we decolonize automation and put central in our work and activism that positions an ethics of care and authenticity as the backbone to our understandings of space and place. And through interlinking these 4 aspects together, the consequences of these relationships more broadly on how we imagine futures can really begin to be understood and transformed. Now, there's kind of 3 consequences of this. So a vision of automation really as a design project is really one that doesn't monopolize or centralize automation, but demonstrates the capacity for automation to begin to accelerate the production of abundance and begin to amplify interdependencies instead of creating more marginalization. So that vision must do the following 3 things. It must confront the value systems and hierarchies embedded in our existing social and spatial practices by rethinking architectural parts. We must redefine automation's capacity to understand increasing access in architectural production for the benefit of more people and many stakeholders, and also consider automation as being transcalar and distributed rather than centralized. So recently we've worked with 2 communities in kind of similar ways. One is Knoll West in Bristol, which is a community in South Bristol, and one is around the Olympic Park in East London. And in both places, we're working with local residents as well as local policymakers, primarily because these are 2 groups that are hugely disadvantaged by the status quo, in that there's really a huge lack of trust from communities on the one hand, which is completely valid, and on the other hand, an inability to really take risk on the other from those local councils. And in Bristol, for example, because of the way that Knoll West expanded, it was a garden city originally. There's really no center to Knoll West. It's also a place where 10 main families live, and they've lived there since it was first built, and they're at the very center of that community. So on the one hand, you have this really rich and deep multi-generational community, but it's also this community that's really stuck in the in-between city and country in this kind of peripheral edge condition. And so sometimes our work looks like a very localized project if we zoom into places like Knoll West, but we believe it is also a large-scale project. We think that by embedding and distributing automation in localized settings, we can design and deploy a much larger network that's coordinated and can operate using our tools and technologies between these communities, as long as that ethics of care about that community and about community begins and remains at the center of that work. So for example, in one of our projects, Block West, we set up a factory, not in your typical factory setting. This was in a arts organization's studio that's typically used for youth group activities. In Hackney, we set up a workshop in a local college, which is a bricklaying workshop. And we used these settings as a place to explore how we might begin to think about like what those communities need. So this is Block West. It's a community housing prototype that has had a second life. Now it doesn't look like this anymore. In No West in Bristol, this project was a 6-month-long or the result of a 6-month-long workshop series, and was built out of 145 block type A's, assembled together from sheet to prototype in less than 2 weeks. And throughout the course of the project, over those 6 months, this was March to September 2020, it provided 25 part-time jobs in the local community. And it's really became this prototype place where we experimented with all the new ways of living and working that we needed to kind of address within that community. It also acted as a training program for more permanent roles that were created by our partners. And in Block West, our group of 25 was 50% women, and we had people aged 12 to 76 involved. And it's really important in a place like No West to really think about how this began to be a seed through which we could begin to form new ways of working together. No West has no center, it has no community hub. There's been historically very little investment, and it's often a place where money washes through rather than adding sustainable value or social infrastructure. And so we are continuing to work in that area to begin to think about how can we help provide the social infrastructure that can really begin to be the community hub that's missing from the area. As part of the project that we're working on a project, of the wider project, we're working on a sliver of the project called Weekend Fab. This is a citizen-led housing factory, originally funded by Innovate UK. And we're developing a digital platform here for multiple different kinds of modular building systems to be produced alongside ours. And collectively, we imagine that this platform can be deployed in a kind of cooperative model for practice, where multiple practices are coming together to begin to help and enable a community to build the kinds of spaces that they need. One of the visions for this was putting together an idea around what that housing factory might look like and how it begins to change over time from factory to house. This is with a double block type A squared. And this really extends existing manufacturing capacity already that exists within the area. So it kind of builds up on existing knowledge and local knowledge. In House Block, in Hackney, in that bricklaying workshop, we worked with New City College. This is a construction program, 16 to 18-year-olds. And over the time that we were there, we brought required work experience that those students were expected to get outside of their school into their school. This made it much more easier for them to access. We also worked with dance studios, the Building Center, Waltham Forest Creative and Future Creatives program, which was another work experience program where we were providing young people interested in careers in design and architecture to begin to curate their own public programs in response to some of the questions that the work proposed that we were doing with them. And the project really served as a kind of mechanism for the council to begin to understand how it can use the smaller bits of land that it owns. These are spaces called nothing spaces, which is highly offensive. They call them nothing spaces. But we were trying to think about how can we begin to use these spaces that are really, developers don't want to develop them, the council can't take the risks. How can we engage the local communities in network building for beginning to rethink how we produce homes in these kinds of sites? And there was a core structure to House Block. It was adapted over time to a series of public program takeovers. We provided spaces for sound installations, dance pieces, meals, parties, roundtables, filming, performances, talks, and we provided paid opportunities for local residents to get involved in the project, both to enable the participation of a diverse group as possible, but also provide 60 part-time weekend jobs in the community, some of which transferred for the next site, to the next site for the blocks from House Block, which I'm not going to talk about now, but I'm happy to talk about it later. This was a 1.5-year long journey, delayed by COVID, but it brought together a group of people from inside and outside of the university. I think is a really good example for us of what engaged scholarship could possibly look like, or one version of what engaged scholarship could possibly look like. And the prototype, I think, really demonstrates what could be achieved if we were to think about participatory approaches to housing, where local communities make use of those digital modes of production, particularly in the spaces that local councils have available that are too risky for them to be able to do anything meaningful with. And we were able to show that meanwhile use of this kind of project brings on board communities that are otherwise perceived to be very disparate or very disconnected from these kinds of issues. It was a real community and network builder within the community itself. We have now also in the company, we're building upon this work with a series of block studios. And it's primarily the work of the spinout, but the frameworks for labor and production that we're developing are related explicitly to the work of the lab. It builds upon the community partnerships that we have in place. In the block studios, we've been working directly with 3 women who all bring similar stories of structural disadvantage, but also aspiration for change, not just in their own lives, but in their communities as well. And the objectives of this project is really to begin to think about how do we seed public participation within housing production? How do we reveal mutually beneficial knowledge exchange on local housing needs and opportunities around automation? How do we nurture the people's in those communities skills in developing and how they document their lives and how they tell their stories? How do we capture those local narratives from our participants and residents to begin to complement and strengthen how we develop impact strategy and policy making? And then also, how do we activate small and micro and backyard and let's say Bristol's version of micro of nothing sites with workspaces and studios for the local community that are co-designed and co-produced by the local community. The block studios are small enough to fit block type A in the back of the Luton van, makes it super easy to transport from their production places nearby to their sites. It allows us to begin to think about more carefully what a factory might look like when it's embedded in a community. And it's really guided by this overarching ambition to understand through the lived experience of the women that we're working with, what expanded ideas of home could look like and what it could offer to those smaller sites, but also how it could begin to scale up to larger sites. Now, ultimately, what we think that our approach begins to do is unravel this notion that is perpetuated often within the discipline and professional practice about who is the expert, who is the professional. And this begins to enable us to think about how do we create a more horizontal framework for wider participation in design automation, and how does the value we create stay within the community itself. And also what it does is enable us to think about how we can invest in the social and technological infrastructure in communities to ensure that they have the skills, the knowledge resources that they need to be able to adapt and recognize and celebrate their interdependence, not just within their community, but also within their built environment, not just in terms of the material resilience that they might grow, but also in terms of the community resilience that they might grow as well. And I'll leave it there. Thanks.
Wow, Molly, thank you so much. That was fantastic. I just want to let you know that unfortunately in the very beginning of your lecture, the live button was forgotten to press. So I'm sorry to those attendees that didn't hear the beginning of the lecture, and we're going to put it online as soon as possible right away, and we'll be sharing that link widely. So I'm sorry if you missed the first few projects that Molly presented, but we will try and remedy that as well as possible. Thank you, Molly. I think this work is so incredible and so connected to a lot of the themes and the ideas that we're also trying to explore with this year-long exhibition, book, residency, workshop also within the Palazzo. I think there's a lot of common interest, especially this idea of like that automation and technology doesn't need to be something that takes away from community. I think your project so eloquently and importantly show that this can be integrated within a community and doesn't need to be the scary robot that takes away our jobs, but instead allows a lot more freedom and important things like modular design that can bring this idea of like the factory into the community and involve people and provide more jobs and have everyone be part of the growth of a building or of a community center. So I just wanted to say thank you for the amazing work. And I would guess that some of the residents maybe have some questions or comments that they want to ask Mollie. I know Davide, for example, he's one of the research residents, and right now he's building a one-to-one house within the palazzo, kind of testing different DIY construction methods that he's learning from YouTube, but such as like cross-laminated timber and making it himself, but also just showing that having a workshop space within even your home or within a local city, like in Venice, that you can build even at the scale of a home within a fancy historic palazzo in Venice, where getting materials is probably one of the most difficult. And I think it's all about like bringing these supply chains and the modes of construction closer and closer to the spaces that they're used. So maybe I hand it over to Davide.
Yeah. Thank you, Mollie, for the talk. Yeah, really interesting. Yeah, it could be super interesting to have maybe one block of the last house, maybe in the space. And I think it's also like easy to pack. So it's also another thing really.
Yeah, I mean, you can
helpful.
cut one if you'd like.
We can. Maybe just could be really interesting.
You can just have a file. I mean, the blocks from Block West and from House Block are, my son is knocking on the door. I don't know why. Go talk to your dad, please. So you can have the CNC file for the blocks for Block West and House Block. You're more than welcome to cut a block.
Awesome.
Yeah, it's also something really interesting about the automation and the fact that it's related to something that you can do maybe in a fab lab, so in a small scale, not in a big scale. So you can also send drawings and not blocks. So it's make it easier to connect with a wider community to build. And I'm just
sorry, he's literally here asking me. Aaron, can you take Archer, please? I'm giving a talk. Okay, sorry. I'm back.
And I'm interested in which way it's really a technical question, but how are you making like foundation or like structural elements for the modular house?
So currently in the company, we're not doing any of the groundworks. So we're working with local contractors to do that. The foundations for the studios are micropile foundations or helix foundations. So all that we require is that there's some kind of level ground. But this is the line that we're kind of drawing at the moment around foundations and site work, because there's lots of people that can do it much better and much more efficiently than us. And then also, what was the next question?
No, just that about foundation. Foundation. And if you have also like drawings, because I'm really interested in details of
so we have we've worked out, we have a modular cladding system that works with the core structures. We have iterated it quite a lot since those earlier projects. I mean, those earlier projects were literally like August 2020 and March 2021. So they're, for us, really old now. Even though they're not in historically time that old. So they've come on a long way in terms of the detailing, a significantly long way. And part of that has been because in the company, we've formed a partnership with ABB Robotics over the summer, and that's accelerated the iteration of the building system for the full automation of the blocks in a way that it's transformed it quite a bit. So the post-tensioning that we have, all of those details are pretty much readily available online, but the most recent stuff is not.
Okay, thank you.
Molly, thank you so much for the talk. It was really amazing to see an alternative to automation. And to me, what's really also a challenge and one of the pressing questions when introducing a new technique is the political realm and how regulations and standardizations of materials or techniques, really there is a big fight and also a long process to really include these practices. So I don't know if you can talk a little bit about introducing this into the codes or into the general understanding of this alternative practice for now, at least.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, it's so currently with all the smaller scale stuff, we're able to do it within permitted development. So we're actually bypassing building regs to allow us to iterate the building system as quickly as possible because the scale of them allow us to do that prototyping really quickly. When we start to scale up into houses, one of the ways that we're working right now is we've developed a set of guarantees around the building system. And we have to go and we have to start doing a journey onto warranties, which is terrifying, to be honest. In the UK, extremely onerous and will be a multi-year process. So we're going to start the process for getting what's called BOPAS certification. So, which means that we are going to have to compromise a bit the versatility of the building system. That's kind of as loosely as, or as specifically as I can describe it right now. But the versatility is having to, yeah, we're going to have to compromise on that, which means it can't do everything anymore. It can still do a lot, but it's more finite than using the post-tensioning the way that it's in House Block or in Block West. And that's a way to get around it, basically. But other than that, to be honest, MMC, like this is an MMC system. We have a lot of them. And as long as we kind of sit in relationship to things like fire safety, etc., it's actually not that difficult in the UK to meet those building regs. The biggest thing is actually warranties in terms of mortgages and meeting that certification process.
Some questions still in the chat. I think it's just I'll go check. Yeah.
No, it's just me.
Okay. I also have another kind of question, maybe related also to the scalability of the projects. Maybe about the cost efficiency. Maybe if you can go a little bit more into elaborate a little bit on that.
So there's a couple of different elements of this. One is about production chain length. So we're trying to develop a super short supply chain for most of the production of the parts themselves. And that we might not necessarily have a super short production chain in terms of materials, but we do in terms of parts. So, and that's primarily because in the UK, for example, there's no timber supply. It doesn't exist. So how can we simplify the system as much as possible so that we can keep that shortness is a big question for us. Then also in terms of production of the parts themselves. So that's really important. In terms of in terms of scalability of the system itself, we are the first two prototypes that we did were not using a final building material. We'll probably move to LVL over the next few months. With the building, as we start to scale up into houses, we have a couple of two-story extensions lined up for next year that use this system. So we're going to have to change materials as a result of that. But again, those material choices are part of some of the strategic partnerships that we're building. So it's kind of an ecosystem, to be honest, of how you relate those decisions in relationship to one another. And the part itself can currently go up to a building of about 5 or 6 stories. To go any higher, you have to change the part, but you don't need to change the part in terms of its intelligence. You need to change the part in terms of its size. What it does create is a lot of material redundancy. So then how do you deal with that material redundancy? To a certain degree, in terms of affordability, the more blocks that you have, you get more bang for your buck, that's the American phrase for it, when you go a bit bigger. So if your budget, for example, for a dwelling unit is 15 grand, which is kind of the average cost right now for 10 to 15 square meter dwelling unit, if you add 5 grand to that, you can get an extra 10 square meters. So you kind of actually achieve a lot more, and you have a lot more customization and specificity by spending a little bit more to be able to get that with our system, which no other systems can actually do, which allows us to keep costs down generally. We can also predict costs extremely efficiently. We've built a whole we have a whole tool that we're building and continuously updating that allows us to accurately predict costs on a project and update it in real time. So the material cost spikes, for example, that we've seen over the last 6 months, we've been able to still deliver on budget on our projects, despite timber prices, for example, going up 134% in the UK.
Wow. It's really exciting. And just even the amount that you've grown the project in the past years when everything was locked down, it's an incredible effort.
I mean, it made us, I will say, we are like, we have gotten where we are because we were locked down.
Yeah.
Me and Jill finally had to stop traveling, and it meant that we could be in the same time zone at the same time, and we were able to double our team. So
it's really exciting. And again, actually, my apologies for not saying the name right. AUAR, I think it's a
don't worry, it's fine.
Amazing name, and I just wasn't reading it in that way, but good name. Thank you so much, Mollie, for taking the time and to speak with us and to share your work. And we're so glad to have it as part of this non-extractive architecture universe that we're building as this ongoing archive of important ideas around this topic. So we're really—
Thanks for having me.